The world had traded leather for steel, and Bill Miner felt the chill of it in his 62-year-old bones. It was the spring of 1906, and from his hidden vantage point in the rolling hills of British Columbia, he watched the Canadian Pacific Railway's Transcontinental Express slice through the landscape. It wasn't like the old days. This was no clumsy stagecoach lumbering through a dusty canyon. This was an iron serpent, breathing steam and smoke, a creature of the new century, loud, arrogant, and brutally efficient. Miner watched it with the critical eye of an artist assessing a new, unfamiliar medium. He was a master of a dying craft, a relic who had outlived his own legend, and he was planning one last masterpiece. He was a small man with a neatly trimmed gray mustache and eyes the color of a faded sky. Those eyes had seen the inside of San Quentin, witnessed the California gold rush, and watched the West transform from a vast, lawless frontier into a grid of fenced-in properties and telegraph wires. He was known as the Gray Fox, the gentleman bandit, a man who had robbed more stages and trains than he could count, but who, by all accounts, had never intentionally harmed a soul. His politeness was as legendary as his crimes. He was credited with coining the phrase that would define an era of outlaws: hands up. But that era was over. Men now talked of horseless carriages, of flying machines, of moving pictures. The Pinkertons were using forensic techniques, and a man's description could be wired across the continent in minutes. Robbing a train was no longer a matter of a fast horse and a steady nerve. It was a fool's game against an interconnected, ever-watchful system. Yet here was Bill Miner, planning to do it the old way, with horses, with 6 guns, and with a stubborn refusal to accept that the world had left him behind. This wasn't just about the money, though he certainly needed it. This was about defiance. It was a final desperate attempt to prove that a man with grit and a good horse could still make his mark on a world that was trying to erase him. He was about to write the last chapter of the Wild West, even if he was the only one who left to know how to read the language.
As he watched the train disappear, Miner's mind drifted back. He remembered a time when the world was slower, wider, and a man's reputation was his currency. He was born in the 1840s, a time when the West was still a rumor. His first crime was stealing a horse. His first prison sentence taught him that he wasn't built for a cage. It was in the 1870s and 80s that he perfected his craft, primarily with stagecoaches. He developed a style, a code. He was never cruel. He would often apologize to the ladies for the inconvenience and was known to leave passengers with a few dollars for their next meal. This was the birth of the gentleman bandit. He remembered one particular robbery on the Sonora Road. The sun was a hammer, the dust a choking shroud. When the stagecoach driver pulled up his team, Miner stepped out from behind a rock, his face covered by a bandana, his Colt level. "Hands up, friends, and nobody will be the worse for wear," he'd said, his voice calm and steady. While his partner kept the driver covered, Miner dealt with the passengers. He took the mail sack and the Wells Fargo strongbox, but when a young woman began to cry, fearful he would take her locket, he tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he'd said, "I'm a robber, not a ghoul. You keep your memories." He then vanished into the landscape, leaving behind a story that would be told and retold, each telling, polishing his legend. But that world was gone. The stagecoaches had been replaced by trains, and his long stints in prison, nearly 33 years of his life spent behind bars, had served as time capsules. Each time he was released, he emerged into a world that had accelerated without him. His last release, from San Quentin in 1901, was the most jarring. He was an old man in a new century. He tried to go straight, working odd jobs, even as an oyster fisherman. But the quiet, honest life chafed. It felt like a different kind of prison. The call of the outlaw life, the only life where he had ever truly been a master, was too strong. He drifted north to the new frontiers of Washington and British Columbia, searching for a piece of the world that still made sense to him, a place where a man on a horse could still be king.
In a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods near the South Thompson River, the plan took its final shape. Miner was not working alone. He had recruited 2 accomplices. The first was William "Shorty" Dunn, a younger man with a nervous energy and a reputation for being quick-tempered. He lacked Miner's finesse, but possessed a brutish loyalty. The second was Louis Colquhoun, a quiet ranch hand who knew the local terrain like the back of his hand. He was the guide, the key to their escape into the labyrinthine wilderness. They were a makeshift crew, a far cry from the hardened outlaws of Miner's youth. Miner spread a crude map on the rough-hewn table, the flickering light of a kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Here," he said, his finger tracing a line on the map. "Just west of Kamloops, near Monty Creek. There's a sharp bend in the track where the engine has to slow to a crawl. The land is flat on one side, perfect for the approach. Thick woods on the other, perfect for the disappearance." It was a classic plan, one he could have used on the Central Pacific Line 30 years ago. He was applying the logic of the stagecoach era to the age of steam. "What about the mail car?" Shorty asked, his voice edgy. "Last time, that clerk gave us trouble." Miner nodded, remembering their first, less successful Canadian robbery a couple of years prior. "We'll be more persuasive this time," he said calmly. "We uncouple the passenger cars, isolate the engine and the mail car. No heroes, no audience. We handle the crew, you handle the dynamite for the safe. Louis, you keep the horses ready. We move quiet, we move polite, and we melt away before they even know what's happened." He spoke with the quiet authority of a master craftsman. He was in his element. The thrill of the planning stage was a familiar, intoxicating tonic. For a moment, in the warm glow of the lamp, he wasn't an old man on the verge of obsolescence. He was the gray fox again, cunning and timeless, about to lead one last hunt. The world outside could rush toward its noisy future, but in this cabin, time had stood still.
On the evening of May 8th, 1906, a cool mist hung in the air, muffling sound and shrouding the landscape in a ghostly gray. It was perfect. The Transcontinental Express, its single headlamp cutting a bright, lonely cone through the darkness, chugged and hissed as it approached the bend at Monty Creek. Inside, passengers were reading, playing cards, or settling down for the night, blissfully unaware that they were about to become a footnote in the final chapter of a forgotten history. From the woods, Miner, Shorty, and Louie spurred their horses, their hooves making soft thuds on the damp earth. They flagged the train down using a red lantern, the universal signal for danger on the tracks. As the massive engine ground to a halt with a deafening screech of steel on steel, the engineer and fireman peered out, expecting to see a rock slide or a washed-out bridge. Instead, they saw the muzzles of 2 Colt revolvers. "A pleasant evening to you, gentlemen," Miner said, his voice level and calm, carrying easily in the sudden quiet. "We'll be relieving you of the company's payroll. If you cooperate, you'll be on your way shortly." The professionalism of the operation was startling. While Shorty held the engine crew, Miner and Louie quickly uncoupled the express and passenger cars, leaving them stranded on the track. They ordered the engineer to pull the engine, tender, and mail car a mile down the line, isolating the scene of the crime. There were no wild whoops or drunken threats. This was business. When they reached the designated spot, Miner approached the mail car. "Evening, postal clerk. Would you be so kind as to open up? We have a withdrawal to make." He was playing his part perfectly. He was the gentleman bandit, and this was his stage. The cold mist, the dark woods, the hissing engine, it was all a backdrop for his final performance. But he was about to discover that the other actors were no longer following the old script. When he tried to blow up the safe, only to discover that Canada was using child-resistant safes, he lost it. He finally snapped and yelled like a raging lunatic. "We have to kill everyone before they tell others. They will tell the world." One by one, all the postal workers and travelers were killed. It turned out to be a bloodbath.
The clerk inside the mail car was no trembling greenhorn. He was a company man who had heard stories of these robberies, and he refused to open the door. A muffled, "Go to hell," was the only reply Miner received. The politeness of the old days had met the stubbornness of the new. Miner sighed. This was always the part he disliked, the turn from smooth operation to messy complication. "Shorty," he called, "the persuasive argument." Shorty Dunn, eager for action, placed a small charge of dynamite against the door. The resulting explosion was a dull, unsatisfying thud that splintered the wood, but failed to break the lock. It took them nearly an hour of chipping, prying, and cursing before they finally forced their way into the car. Inside, they found the clerk, dazed but defiant. The main prize, the safe containing a rumored CPR payroll of thousands of dollars, stood bolted to the floor. Miner, ever the professional, tried to get the combination from the clerk, who only spat in response. More dynamite was required. The process was loud, clumsy, and frustrating. This wasn't the clean, surgical strike Miner had envisioned. It was a brute force demolition job. When the safe was finally blown, its door buckled and smoking, the loot was a bitter disappointment. There was no massive payroll. Instead, they found a few registered mail pouches containing less than $100, a small sack of silver coins, and bizarrely, a bottle of liver pills. All that planning, all that risk, for what amounted to little more than pocket change. Shorty Dunn was furious, kicking the ruined safe and cursing their luck. But Miner was quiet. He understood what this meant. The world had changed. Payrolls weren't being shipped in obvious strongboxes anymore. They were moved irregularly, with armed guards, their schedules kept secret. Information moved faster than a galloping horse. His methods, once brilliantly effective, were now hopelessly obsolete. He had planned a robbery for 1886, and it had failed in 1906. Tipping his hat to the still defiant clerk, Miner grabbed the meager haul. "Our apologies for the mess," he said, his voice laced with an irony only he could appreciate. The performance was over, and the reviews were poor.
As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, 3 riders melted into the dense, rain-soaked forests of British Columbia. This was Miner's true element, the escape. Here the telegraph and the railroad were useless. This was a world of game trails, hidden canyons, and tangled undergrowth, a world where a man's worth was measured by his endurance and his knowledge of the land. For a few days it felt like old times. They rode hard, covering their tracks, living off the land and putting miles between themselves and the bungled robbery. The meager loot was a source of constant friction, with Shorty Dunn grumbling incessantly. But Miner felt a sense of peace. He was a ghost in his own element, a creature of the wilderness. They followed the guidance of Louis Colquhoun, who led them through a network of trails known only to a few local ranchers and First Nations people. They waded their horses through streams to hide their scent, and climbed to high ridges to watch their back trail. For a week they saw no sign of pursuit. It seemed they had done it. They had staged an Old West robbery and had vanished in an Old West fashion. Miner allowed himself a flicker of hope. Perhaps he wasn't a relic after all. Perhaps there was still a place for him in this world. But the world was smaller than it used to be. The news of the robbery had not faded into local legend. It had become a national sensation. The Canadian Pacific Railway, a symbol of national pride and progress, had been embarrassed. They put up a massive reward. And the Northwest Mounted Police, a force renowned for its tenacity, took on the hunt not just as a job, but as a matter of honor. While Miner, Dunn, and Colquhoun were navigating by the sun and stars, the law was closing a net woven with telegraph wires, railway lines, and the combined knowledge of dozens of trackers and informants. The wilderness was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. And the walls were closing in, one telegraph pole and one railway tie at a time. Miner could outride a posse, but he couldn't outrun a telegram.
The manhunt for the gentleman bandit was a collision of centuries. On one side was Bill Miner, employing the time-honored tactics of a 19th-century outlaw. On the other was the relentless, modern machinery of 20th-century law enforcement. The Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, were not your average small-town posse. They were a disciplined, semi-military force. They used the railway to rapidly deploy officers to key towns and junctions, effectively sealing the area. Telegraphs chattered constantly, sharing descriptions, sightings, and strategies between detachments. The key to the manhunt was a legendary NWMP constable, J.W. Jack Budd, and a group of local First Nations trackers whose skills in the wilderness far surpassed those of the outlaws. While Miner's crew saw an impenetrable forest, the trackers saw a story written in broken twigs, disturbed soil, and faint hoofprints. They read the land like a book, and every page told them where the fugitives had been. The posse didn't just chase, they anticipated. They knew the fugitives would need food and supplies, and they quietly put the word out to every remote ranch and settlement, offering a share of the reward for information.
The fugitives, exhausted and running low on food, were unaware of the invisible net tightening around them. Their world had shrunk to the next ridge, the next stream. They were physically free, but systematically trapped. The relentless pursuit began to wear on them. The constant rain, the meager food, and the simmering tension over the failed robbery frayed their nerves. Shorty Dunn became increasingly paranoid and aggressive. Only Miner remained calm, but even he could feel the shift. The silence of the woods no longer felt like a comforting blanket. It felt like a trap, waiting to be sprung. The ghost of the modern world he had tried to escape was catching up. Its footsteps, the soft moccasins of the trackers on the trail behind them.
The end came near a place called Douglas Lake. After 11 days on the run, the fugitives were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. They'd been spotted by a rancher while trying to buy food, and the posse, led by Constable Bud, finally had their location pinpointed. They set up a careful ambush surrounding the small grove of trees where the outlaws had made a desperate cold camp. There was no grand charge, no thunder of hooves. The end of the last great horseback robbery came with the quiet click of rifle hammers being cocked. "Bill Miner, this is the mounted police. You are surrounded. Come out with your hands up." The voice cut through the morning stillness. Shorty Dunn panicked, grabbing his rifle and firing blindly into the woods. It was a fatal mistake. The posse returned fire, a disciplined volley that ripped through the trees. Lewis Colhoun, the ranch hand who just wanted a payday, threw his hands up in immediate surrender. Miner, however, remained calm. He knew the game was up. He stood slowly, his hands empty, and stepped into the clearing. He saw the ring of red-coated Mounties, their rifles all trained on him. It was a sight he had never seen in all his years, such organized, overwhelming force. He didn't look defeated. He looked resigned. He was an artist who had run out of canvas, a king whose kingdom had vanished. As they put the cuffs on him, he looked at Constable Bud, a man half his age, representative of the new order. "I'm sorry," Miner said, not with fear, but with a strange professional regret. "You boys caught me on an off day." Even in capture, he was the gentleman bandit. Shorty Dunn was found moments later, having been wounded in the leg, his foolish bravado evaporating into whimpers of pain. The Gray Fox, the legend who had danced between raindrops for 50 years, had finally been caught in the storm of progress.
The trial of Bill Miner was a spectacle. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a celebrity, a living embodiment of the Wild West that people were already reading about in dime novels. Newspapers across North America breathlessly reported the story of the last of the old-time bandits. He played the part to perfection in the courtroom, charming the jury, regaling reporters with stories, and presenting himself as a harmless romantic, a man born in the wrong century. He was found guilty, of course. The evidence was overwhelming, and sentenced to life in the British Columbia Penitentiary. But for Bill Miner, prison walls were merely a temporary inconvenience. A year later, in 1907, he executed a final, brilliant act of defiance. He and several other inmates escaped, digging their way out. While the others were quickly recaptured, the 64-year-old Gray Fox vanished. Rumors swirled for years. Some said he made his way back to the United States, living out his final years in quiet obscurity. Others said he died in the wilderness. The truth is, no one really knows. He simply disappeared, leaving his legend to fill the void. Bill Miner wasn't the most successful outlaw, nor the most fearsome, but he was perhaps the most significant. He was the bookend to a chapter of history. His final horseback robbery was not just a crime, it was a performance, a piece of living theater that demonstrated the end of an archetype. He was a ghost on horseback, haunting a world of steel and steam, reminding it of a time when the West was wild, and a man's destiny could be decided by the speed of his horse and the strength of his nerve. He was the sound of a closing door, the final lonesome echo of the cowboy's gallop, fading into the roar of the 20th century.